All right, welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're going to be jumping into something pretty fascinating, something really making us think. We're talking about using technology to, actually boost kids' brain power, their cognitive abilities.
Okay, sounds interesting.
Yeah, so a recent survey from Singapore showed that people there are surprisingly open to things like, polygenic embryo screening.
So that's where you look at embryos and try to figure out the chances of them having certain traits, right?
Exactly, and even gene editing.
Wow.
And the goal here, of course, is to, try to make kids smarter.
And it's interesting to think about why there's so much excitement for this in Singapore, especially when you compare it to, maybe more cautious reactions we see in other parts of the world.
Right, and to really understand what's going on here, we're going deep into a paper called Caveats on Human Cognitive Enhancement Technologies based on the sociocultural context of Singapore. It takes a critical look at all this positive feeling around making kids smarter, and it's actually a direct response to a study done by Haining and some other researchers where they specifically looked at what Singaporeans think about cognitive enhancement.
Got it.
So our aim today is to really explore the possible downsides, the complexities, especially when we think about Singapore's unique, societal makeup.
It sounds like the paper we're looking at is saying there's more to the story than just, hey, let's make smarter kids.
Exactly.
So the study, the original one, kind of hinted that boosting cognitive abilities could actually help kids become more independent. Mm-hmm. The thinking there was that, if you improve a child's reasoning skills, they might be able to make more of their own choices.
Right.
What does this response paper have to say about that?
Okay, so this is really important. This response paper, written by Chin and Musin, offers a different perspective, especially when we factor in Singapore's culture. They describe it as, how do they put it? It's like a hyper-competitive, shame-conscious Confucian society where there's this big fear of losing what they call kiasu.
Interesting.
So imagine a culture where, avoiding public failure and keeping social harmony are really, really valued.
Right, that makes sense.
And that puts a lot of pressure on people, especially when it comes to things like, success in school.
So in that kind of environment, if you already have this strong drive to succeed, how might that actually affect kids who have, let's say, undergone cognitive enhancement?
That's where the paper gets really interesting. It suggests that in this kind of setup, parents who are already super invested in their kids' success, we might call them tiger parents, are going to have even higher expectations for their already enhanced children.
I see what you mean.
Right. They've made a big investment, so to speak. So the push for, top grades, top achievements could become even more intense. And the paper argues that this heightened pressure could actually backfire and limit the child's freedom, their autonomy.
In a way, it almost creates a paradox. You enhance a child's abilities with the hope of giving them more freedom, but then societal and parental expectations kind of clamp down on them even harder.
Yeah, exactly. Technology by itself doesn't guarantee freedom. You have to consider those societal structures, those cultural values. They all play a huge role in how these advancements are actually used and what their impact really is.
And you mentioned earlier that, Singaporean parents already spend a ton of money on tuition, enrichment classes, things like that.
Oh, absolutely. It's remarkable how much they invest in their children's education, all to give them a competitive edge.
So imagine what happens if cognitive enhancement actually becomes a real possibility.
Right, that existing pressure cooker environment could get amplified even more.
Right. It's worth thinking about whose benefit this enhancement is really for.
Yeah.
Is it truly for the child's individual growth and happiness? Or is it more about meeting these broader societal expectations?
It's a crucial question, and it kind of leads into the next point the paper brings up, which is this idea that cognitive enhancement would automatically lead to greater happiness and well-being.
Okay, let's talk about that.
So there's this assumption, right, that if you make someone more intelligent, more capable, they'll just naturally be happier. But the paper kind of pushes back on that.
How so?
Well, these enhanced kids, they might develop their own goals, their own passions that don't actually line up with what their parents or society expects of them.
Oh, I can see where that could lead to some conflict.
Definitely. And in a place like Singapore, with its super competitive education system where so much of your identity and your sense of fulfillment is tied to how well you do compared to others, this mismatch between personal goals and external expectations could really make someone unhappy.
Right. It wouldn't necessarily be this happy, fulfilling situation that people might imagine.
And that's where the paper introduces this idea called the Red Queen principle.
The Red Queen principle. I'm not familiar with that. Can you explain it for our listeners?
Sure, imagine you're in a race where everybody keeps getting faster, but the finish line never moves.
Okay, I'm starting to see the connection.
That's kind of what the Red Queen principle is getting at. If everyone is getting cognitively enhanced, just being enhanced doesn't guarantee you a better spot in the pecking order, academically or socially. You probably have to work even harder just to keep up.
So instead of this guaranteed boost in happiness, you might actually end up with a more stressed out, less happy population.
Yeah, constantly trying to outdo each other in a race that never really ends.
That's a thought-provoking point. Now, another argument you often hear in favor of cognitive enhancement is this idea of procreative beneficence.
Right.
This idea that if we enhance our kids' traits, it'll ultimately give them better prospects in life. But the paper has some interesting counter-arguments to that, especially within the Singaporean context.
And this is where the conversation gets really grounded in reality, especially when you look at what's happening in the job market today. The paper really questions whether having super impressive academic qualifications, even for these enhanced individuals, will actually translate into better job opportunities in Singapore.
Okay, I'm curious to hear more about that.
Well, they bring up a really important point. The massive growth of higher education in Singapore and other parts of Asia has actually led to a surplus of university graduates.
Oh, wow. So that old idea of better grades equals a better job, That's not as certain as it used to be.
Maybe not. The paper actually gives some pretty striking stats about Singapore. As of 2022, over 80% of young adults there have some kind of post-secondary qualification.
Wow.
And around 60% have a university degree.
That's a huge percentage.
Oh.
What does that mean for people who might considering cognitive enhancement, hoping it will give them a leg up in the job market?
Well, it's creating this imbalance. You have all these highly qualified graduates, but Singapore is actually facing shortages in areas that need more technical and vocational skills.
Interesting.
So even if you're incredibly smart and you have a fancy degree, the jobs that are available might not actually match up with your qualifications or the expectations that might come with being enhanced.
So you might end up with this large pool of highly educated, even cognitively enhanced individuals, all competing for a limited number of high-paying, suitable jobs.
Right, and the paper goes on to draw parallels with other East Asian countries that are facing similar challenges. They point to places like Japan and South Korea, where a lot of really qualified grads are ending up in low-paying temporary positions, which is contributing to the growth of the gig economy.
Right, I've heard about that.
And in China, there are even reports of graduates taking blue-collar jobs just to find work. This disconnect between having great credentials and actually finding success has led to some social issues too, like hikikomori in Japan and South Korea, where people basically withdraw from society.
Right. It's almost like a sense of disillusionment with the system.
Exactly. And then there's the lying flat or let it rot movements in China, which kind of reflect this feeling of, giving up on the rat race.
It sounds like a pretty bleak outcome, especially if cognitive enhancement just adds more fuel to that fire.
Exactly, that's the concern. It could utterly make this existing trend worse, with more and more highly qualified people competing for the same few good jobs, which could lead to even more social unrest.
It's a pretty sobering perspective, the idea that enhancing cognitive abilities might actually contribute to a more competitive and possibly less fulfilling job market. Now, let's shift gears a bit and talk about the argument that cognitive enhancement could somehow level the playing field.
Okay.
The paper seems pretty skeptical about that idea.
And for good reason. The authors argue that when you actually look at the practical side of things, like access and cost, this idea of leveling the playing field just doesn't hold water.
Right, I can see that.
Reprogenetic technologies, like the ones we're talking about, polygenic embryo screening and gene editing, are likely to be incredibly expensive.
Oh, definitely. It's not just the technology itself, it's all the medical procedures that go along with it, like in vitro fertilization, right?
Exactly. And the paper suggests that there probably won't be much political will to subsidize cognitive enhancement, at least not to the extent that things like life-saving treatments or essential healthcare are subsidized.
That makes sense. It's more likely to be seen as an elective enhancement, right? Not like a basic medical need.
Exactly. So the most likely scenario is that only families with a lot of money will be able to afford these enhancements.
Which, of course, raises concerns about widening the gap between the rich and the poor.
Exactly. It could really worsen socioeconomic disparities. And in Singapore, which is a multiracial society where there are already economic differences between certain ethnic groups, this could really exacerbate those tensions.
Right. It could create a situation where privilege is just passed down even more strongly.
Exactly. And the paper also brings up another really important issue for Singapore, which is demographic decline.
Okay, how does cognitive enhancement play into that?
It's interesting, right? So Singapore is already dealing with a rapidly aging population and very low birth rates.
I've heard about that.
And the authors suggest that the high cost of these technologies, especially without any help from the government, could make things even worse.
I can see how that would be a factor. If parents have to spend a huge amount of money to enhance one child, they might be less likely or even unable to have more kids.
Exactly. And the paper makes the point that the costs of these technologies aren't likely to go down anytime soon because of how complex and labor-intensive they are. So the concern is that more and more couples might choose to have just one superior child instead of having several, which would just accelerate this demographic decline that's already happening.
And that could have some pretty serious consequences down the line, both for the economy and for the country's future as a whole.
Exactly. And it brings us to the last major point that the paper emphasizes: the importance of taking into account the sociocultural context when we're thinking about how to use these technologies responsibly.
Okay, so it's not just about the technology itself, it's about how it fits into the specific culture and values of a society.
Exactly. The authors make it clear that healthcare policy priorities can be very different between a place like Singapore and many Western countries.
How so?
Well, Singapore places a lot of emphasis on communal well-being, on social harmony. So they might be more likely to focus on the potential impact of these technologies on society as a whole, rather than just on individual rights and choices.
That's a really interesting distinction. So to sum up, we've talked about several important caveats that this response paper raises. The initial enthusiasm for cognitive enhancement in Singapore might not fully consider the possibility of reduced autonomy for children, a potential decrease in overall well-being, uncertain job prospects, greater socioeconomic inequality, and even a worsening of the demographic decline that's already happening.
Exactly. It's a reminder that we can't just focus on the potential benefits of making smarter kids. We have to think about the bigger picture, the wider impact on society.
It's about making sure that these technologies are used in a way that benefits everyone, not just a select few. And that brings us to a final thought for our listeners. When we consider all these complex societal factors, what does progress really mean when it comes to human development and well-being? And how can we ensure that these advancements, while exciting, are implemented in a way that truly serves the greater good, both for individuals and for society as a whole? It's a question worth pondering.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive. We'll see you next time.